Hey guys, tonight we slip through the golden gates of ancient Egypt, not as curious tourists, but as insiders who know just how miserable it could be to be a pharaoh. You trudge down sun-baked palace corridors, the air thick with incense and the faint, unsettling scent of animal sacrifice. Every step echoes with the weight of millennia of expectation. The walls are adorned with elaborate murals showing you, yes, you as a god among mortals, lifting your crook and flail with practiced ease. But behind that painted smile lies a childhood riddled with more political backstabbing than a soap opera. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments so we can see just how far back in history you're listening from tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are born into power, but also a lifetime sentence of scrutiny. From the moment your first cries echo in the palace chamber, priests and nobles whisper about your destiny. Your parents, likely your royal mother and the previous pharaoh, are already entangled in a web of court intrigue. Every toy you grasp, every smile you flash, is evaluated by a silent tribunal of advisors who can make or break your future. Your first lessons aren't ABCs or nursery rhymes. No, instead, you're taught the sacred geometry of pyramids, the proper posture for performing sacrifices, and how to memorize exhaustive genealogies of your ancestors so you can assert your divine right with all the subtlety of a sandstorm. Your tutors, often high priests with half-mad eyes and questionable motivations, repeat mantras about mad, the cosmic order you must uphold at all costs. Historians still argue whether this early indoctrination was meant to build character or crush individuality. Some suggest it was a psychological cage, designed to make you dependent on courtly approval. Others think it was a practical necessity. After all, running a country of millions is hard when you barely know how to wipe your own nose. But let's not forget the fringe theories, like that peculiar belief some have that the youngest pharaohs were sometimes viewed as living children of the gods and subjected to bizarre rites. Imagine a 3-year-old wearing ceremonial leopard skins and being forced to perform rituals normally reserved for battle-hardened priests. That's less precocious monarch and more tiny sacrificial puppet. And as you grow, so does the burden. Childhood illnesses, instant political crisis, a small rash, possible bad omen. You learn quickly to smile through pain because weakness invites rivals to circle like vultures. Even your birthday becomes a state affair, your survival celebrated not as a joyous personal milestone, but as proof of divine favor. Your meals aren't simple affairs either. The palace kitchens churn out elaborate dishes of fowl, dates, and honeyed pastries, probably delicious, but also subject to endless quality control by suspicious food tasters. After all, every pharaoh lives in fear of assassination by poisoned fig. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen your predecessors swore by. Yeah, probably a bad idea, but hygiene standards back then weren't exactly stellar. Despite the opulence, you can't escape that gnawing sense that every gesture, every uttered syllable, is being recorded, judged, and potentially twisted by ambitious courtiers. Friends are rare, alliances even rarer, and enemies so numerous they might as well be a second court. As you approach your first official public appearance, the weight of expectation settles heavier than your headdress. The people are waiting, the priests are chanting, and the scribes are already preparing future inscriptions about this very moment. You step into the limelight, a child wearing the mantle of eternity, blissfully unaware that your reign is already a ticking time bomb of tradition, paranoia, and political rivalry. Pharaoh's early life, cursed from birth. You're born into unimaginable privilege and an avalanche of stress, where every diaper change feels like a political crisis, and your earliest lessons are about death, power, and keeping court intrigue from poisoning your lunch. The sunlight hits your face like 1,000 judgmental eyes as you rise from your silk-draped bed, its threads woven from the finest flax Egypt can offer. You already know your day will not be restful. In fact, rest is something pharaohs only experience in carefully staged moments between one ritual and the next, always shadowed by the pressing demands of administration, religion, and public image. Your morning begins with the familiar cacophony of servants bustling through the palace corridors. Their sandals slap against the polished limestone floors as they carry trays of honeyed bread, roasted quail, and fresh figs. The smell is heady, but you barely taste it. Your appetite is secondary to duty. A high-ranking scribe stands nearby, ready to present you with a report, the latest tax receipts, records of grain stockpiles, and complaints from provincial governors. These scribes, more than mere record keepers, are the eyes and ears of the state, their inked hieroglyphs capable of elevating or destroying your reputation. You trudge from chamber to chamber, each more elaborate than the last. Walls of painted scenes depict past glories, your ancestors' conquests, and ceremonies promising divine order. Yet somehow, these images feel less like celebration and more like pressure. You remember the odd fringe belief whispered among palace insiders that a pharaoh was meant to embody not just godhood, but the collective will of the people, a notion that sounds noble in theory but becomes suffocating in practice. By mid-morning, you're expected to preside over the tax collection ritual. You don't just receive reports, you actively participate. Nobles and tax collectors present ledgers with columns of numbers representing grain, livestock, and artisan work owed by the provinces. The scribes record each decree you pronounce with unnerving precision, as if the sound of your voice could shape the land itself. The mainstream historical fact here is clear. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs were absolute rulers, but their power wasn't unchecked. They relied on an elaborate bureaucracy to manage the sprawling empire. The viziers beneath you carried enormous responsibility, acting as intermediaries between your royal word and the distant provinces. Their loyalty was critical, though not always guaranteed. In fact, historians still argue whether the pharaoh truly held supreme power, or was largely a figurehead propped up by religious authority and civil administration. Some suggest the bureaucracy was so developed that your daily involvement in mundane matters, tax collection, construction oversight, temple offerings, was more ceremonial than necessary. Others argue that without your active hand, the empire would fragment into competing fiefdoms. Speaking of fiefdoms, there's that quirky tidbit no guidebook mentions. Pharaohs sometimes had to personally inspect mud brick walls of temples and granaries to ensure structural integrity. This wasn't some ceremonial stroll. You would squat down, tap bricks with a ceremonial mallet, and declare them sound or in need of repair. Imagine the indignity of being a god inspecting walls like an overzealous building inspector. Yes, Your Highness, this wall appears adequately straight, though the mortar is slightly crumbly, not exactly the stuff of divine dignity. Around noon, you face the obligatory audience with foreign emissaries. They arrive in elaborate procession, carrying gifts ranging from exotic incense to semi-precious stones. Their eyes are trained on you, hopping to read your reaction, your favor, or your disfavor. Diplomacy in ancient Egypt was a strange dance of deference and dominance, where protocol could be as dangerous as betrayal. You perform your part with practiced grace, offering words of blessing in hieroglyphs whose meanings are more political than sincere. You understand that one poorly chosen phrase could spark conflict, or worse, suggest weakness. The fringe theory suggests some pharaohs would intentionally speak in ambiguous riddles during these meetings, as if to confuse their opponents or conceal hidden threats. Whether this was clever strategy or court paranoia remains hotly debated. By afternoon, you retreat to the temple precincts for a series of ritual offerings. You present animals, incense, and libations to the gods, who, according to tradition, only bless Egypt when their sovereign performs these rites flawlessly. Each movement is choreographed, practiced until it becomes second nature, yet no less critical. A missed step could be interpreted as a sign that the Nile would not flood that year, or that a famine loomed. Again, the fringe belief persists that some pharaohs genuinely believed their personal virtue directly controlled natural phenomena, a theory modern historians still debate. Through it all, you carry the invisible weight of expectation. The lavish gold bracelets adorning your wrists aren't just ornaments, they're symbols of your status, but also literal burdens. The fringe whispers suggest some pharaohs wore excessively heavy jewelry to ground themselves spiritually, or perhaps just to flaunt their wealth in the most uncomfortable way possible. Whether this was a mark of divine connection or sheer vanity is still an open question. As the sun begins to wane, your day of endless duties shows no sign of slowing. Tax reports pile higher, emissaries linger longer, and the temple rituals stretch on, each moment more hollow than the last. You wonder if your people are praying for your collapse, or simply praying you don't screw up the next mudbrick inspection. The pressure of divine status. Imagine everyone believing you're a god, but historians still argue whether that made life easier or just a heavier chain of expectations, as every sneeze becomes a portent of national disaster. As the sun sinks lower and shadows creep across the desert sands, you begin to feel the true weight of your divine status. Everyone around you treats you like a god, and some days, it's hard to tell if they believe it or if they're just too afraid not to. The priests chant endlessly in the background, their voices echoing like the rumble of distant thunder, while your royal sandals clack across the marble floors as if announcing your every step with exaggerated pomp. Imagine for a moment the strange duality of your existence. On one hand, you're revered above all mortals, sitting atop a throne carved from the finest alabaster, adorned in elaborate linen and gold. On the other hand, you're shackled by expectations that feel heavier than any literal chain. Your image is everywhere, on temple walls, in statues, etched into papyri. Every citizen's prayers are directed toward you, not just as ruler, but as an intermediary between earth and the divine. Historians still argue whether this status of semi-divinity was more helpful or harmful. Some claim it elevated the pharaoh above politics, granting unassailable authority. Others insist it trapped you in a living mausoleum of ceremony, unable to express genuine thought or emotion without risking public scandal. Your mornings begin with ritual purification, not because your body is unclean, but because purity symbolizes your role as Egypt's living god. You're scrubbed and anointed by attendants, your skin oiled with mixtures of frankincense and myrrh. The fringe belief goes that certain pharaohs used crocodile dung mixed with honey as a cosmetic, believing the concoction would ward off evil spirits and blemishes. Whether this was a misinterpreted health remedy or outright madness is still debated among scholars. After purification, you ascend to your public throne in the Great Hall, where the air is thick with incense and tension. Courtiers bow, generals present reports of border conflicts, and priests demand the proper number of offerings to Ra, Osiris, and Isis. Every interaction is a performance. You speak in measured tones, your voice carrying the weight of ages. One wrong word, one misstep in posture, could turn adulation into whispered dissent. Your role as divine figurehead extends beyond ceremony. Every action must reflect perfect harmony, balance, and justice. If famine strikes, the people blame your failure to uphold this cosmic order. If the Nile floods too little or too much, you are seen as having angered the gods. Even your leisure is suspect. When you recline in your private gardens, sipping on wine made from the best grapes, some court whispers that indulgence weakens your divine connection. And here's a quirky fact that doesn't make the history books. Pharaohs reportedly kept miniature servant statues in their private chambers. These tiny figurines were thought to magically serve the king, acting as spiritual proxies that could perform menial tasks or ward off evil. Whether this was a genuine religious belief or a clever superstition is still up for debate, but imagine the oddity of your personal shrine doubling as a magical butler service. The pressure intensifies when your foreign policy decisions come under scrutiny. Trade negotiations, alliances, and declarations of war aren't just political moves, they're interpreted as divine mandates. Your advisors, politically savvy yet perpetually suspicious, frame every choice as a sacred duty. Some fringe theories even suggest that pharaohs would consult oracles who claim to channel the gods. Well, directly, though historians argue about whether these oracles were truly influential or mere court theatrics. Your most daunting challenge lies in succession. Choosing an heir is less about family affection and more about securing stability. The line between dynastic responsibility and political calculation blurs. You remember stories of pharaohs who elevated weak sons simply to ensure the continuation of the bloodline, knowing full well their offspring would be ill-equipped for rule. Worse still, rivals within the royal family scheme to replace you, convinced that divine favor now belongs to them. By nightfall, the court settles into a tense lull. You retreat to your chambers, but rest is elusive. Even in solitude, the sense of omnipresent surveillance never fades. Statues seem to watch you, courtiers' eyes glimmer with suspicion, and every dream feels like a prophecy. You lie awake, acutely aware that being seen as a god is less about reverence and more about control. After all, when everyone believes you're divine, they expect perfection, and perfection is a prison without wall. Weird pharaonic perks and pitfalls. From crocodile dung sunscreen to wearing literal heavy gold chains, you experience bizarre perks and pitfalls that sound more like a curse than a blessing. Historians still debate if these were actually status symbols or just bad ideas. Night falls like a heavy curtain over the palace, but your duties don't light. If anything, they take on a surreal, almost absurd quality under the dim torchlight. You trudge through corridors that seem to stretch endlessly, each step echoing louder in the hush of night. The air is thick with the lingering scent of incense and animal fat, and somewhere in the distance, a servant's whisper blends with the murmured prayers of temple guardians. One of the strangest parts of your life as pharaoh isn't the political intrigue, nor the public spectacles, but the bizarre personal perks that are more curse than privilege. Take the crocodile dung sunscreen, for example. It's not just an urban myth from some sensationalist fringe researcher. It was actually a thing. You're told by the court physicians that this unholy mixture protects your skin from Egypt's brutal sun and evil spirits alike. The theory goes that the pungent stench and sticky texture ward off demons, though modern historians still debate whether this was medical advice gone wrong or a cleverly disguised display of wealth. Either way, you lather it on dutifully, knowing the alternative could be worse: accusations of neglecting your divine duty. Then there's the heavy gold chains draped around your neck and wrists. Ostensibly, they symbolize your unparalleled status, but you secretly suspect they were also a medieval form of bodyweight training. Every step feels like you're dragging a small boulder, and rumors whisper that some pharaohs wore absurdly excessive amounts of jewelry simply to demonstrate their physical endurance. Fringe scholars still argue whether this was a status symbol or a kind of spiritual burden, proof that you were physically shackled by your own godhood. As you wander toward the grand banquet hall, your advisors pressure you to indulge in a ceremonial feast. Platters heave under the weight of exotic meats, honey-glazed pastries, and fruits from far-off lands. But it's not the food that weighs on you. It's the knowledge that every bite is a public statement. You must eat, not because you're hungry, but because abstaining would be seen as weakness, a sign that the gods have abandoned you. The mainstream historical fact is that pharaohs regularly held banquets not simply for sustenance or celebration, but as elaborate displays of power. These meals were highly ritualized, with every dish representing the wealth and reach of the empire. Courtiers would compete for your favor, subtly jockeying for position through flattery and carefully crafted offerings, while musicians played tunes designed to set just the right atmosphere of awe and fear. During the feast, you reflect on the bizarre fringe belief that some pharaohs maintained private chambers filled with small statues representing foreign enemies. These figurines were believed to capture the souls of rivals or dangerous spirits, keeping them trapped within harmless clay bodies. Some historians argue this was an early form of psychological warfare, while others see it as nothing more than superstition. Still, the thought of rows of miniature figures silently witnessing your meals adds an eerie, claustrophobic atmosphere to the already tense air. Later, you retire to the royal gardens, a strange oasis of cultivated plants surrounded by high walls. The moonlight casts long shadows, turning papyrus reeds and date palms into dark silhouettes. Your personal garden isn't just a place of rest, it's a controlled environment designed to mirror the order you're supposed to bring to the cosmos. A fringe theory holds that pharaohs believed tending to this miniature Eden reinforced their connection to the natural world, ensuring that the Nile would flood properly and crops would flourish. As you sit beneath the towering palm trees, a sense of loneliness seeps in. The courtiers, priests, and foreign emissaries all have their agendas. Even your most trusted advisors harbor ambitions. The isolation is complete. Every word you speak is calculated, every smile rehearsed. You wonder if your people see you as a divine figure or as a living monument of state propaganda. Historians still debate the psychological toll of divine status. Was the pharaoh a god who bore the people's hopes, or a prisoner trapped beneath layers of ritual and expectation, doomed never to know personal freedom? Eventually, sleep calls, but it's a fitful, uneasy surrender. You know tomorrow will be the same, a relentless cycle of public adoration, private paranoia, and bizarre traditions that feel less like power and more like performance. Death and legacy, Pharaoh's worst nightmare. You face not just death, but the terrifying prospect of being forgotten, or worse, erased from history, while preparing a tomb that may outlast empires, though whether future archaeologists will understand you remains an open question. The end of your reign is a strange, haunting affair. You've ruled for decades, each year etched deeper into your face like hieroglyphs telling a story only you fully understand. But now, the horizon darkens. Your body weakens, your advisors whisper in hushed tones, and even the priests seem less reverent, as if they already mourn the loss of their god. You face not just the inevitability of death, but the terrifying prospect of being forgotten, or worse, deliberately erased from history. Pharaohs built tombs and pyramids, massive structures intended to secure their legacy for eternity. Yet historians still argue whether these monuments were meant as symbols of immortality or elaborate tombstones masking their anxiety about oblivion. Every decision you make now is colored by the knowledge that your legacy is at stake. The fringe belief goes that some pharaohs went to extreme lengths to ensure they would be remembered, commissioning statues that portrayed them younger than they were, or having scribes write exaggerated accounts of their achievements. Others supposedly had their names inscribed backward or hidden in obscure texts, as if to confuse potential rivals or future generations. Preparing your tomb becomes an obsession. You supervise the layout personally, insisting that every wall be covered in detailed carvings illustrating your triumphs, religious rituals, and divine encounters. The mainstream historical fact here is undeniable. Pharaohs like Khufu and Ramses II invested enormous resources into their burial sites, believing that the quality of these structures would guarantee their place in the afterlife. But even this is a gamble. There's no guarantee that future archaeologists won't misinterpret your achievements, or that tomb robbers won't strip your resting place of treasures. Worse still, you fear being struck from the official records. Damnatio memoriae, a practice where a ruler's name and likeness are systematically erased from history, was a very real threat. Rival successors sometimes employed it to consolidate power, leaving you not just dead, but erased. And there's that quirky detail rarely mentioned in dusty textbooks. Some pharaohs commissioned elaborate false tombs to confuse potential robbers or hostile powers. These decoy burial chambers were often filled with meaningless artifacts, designed to protect the real burial site. Whether this was brilliant strategy or sheer paranoia is still hotly debated, but you couldn't shake the feeling that every step was a gamble. You remember the irony of being worshipped as a god while privately fearing that no one would remember you at all. Each night, as your breath grows shallow, you think of your ancestors. How many of their faces and names are now lost to time, reduced to vague references in temple scrolls or half-erased carvings? The fringe theory even goes further, that some pharaohs believed their spirit would be reborn in the next generation, their legacy not in monuments, but in bloodline. Historians still debate whether this was a genuine religious belief or a comforting fiction invented to soothe the fear of death. Your final days blur into a strange haze of ceremony and solitude. Courtiers continue to smile, priests continue to chant, and scribes continue to copy ancient texts as if nothing has changed. But you know better. You feel yourself slipping, becoming less of a god and more of a relic, a figure doomed to be studied, misunderstood, or forgotten entirely. At last you lie back in your royal chamber, the flickering torchlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. You close your eyes, not with the hope of peace, but with the certainty that your story is already being rewritten, reframed, and slowly lost. Section 6. Viking Death Rituals Unveiled. Explore the mysterious beliefs Vikings held about the afterlife, setting the stage for why they went to such extreme lengths in their burials. You trudge through the damp underbrush of a Nordic forest, the ground squelching under your boots, leaves whispering secrets you'll never understand. The air hangs cold, laced with the scent of pine and the faintest hint of smoke from distant hearths. You're here because you've heard whispers of the Viking ship burial, a ritual that's part spectacle, part superstition, and wholly bizarre by modern standards. But how did this practice even come to be? What made the Vikings so obsessed with sending their dead to sea in a boat? Historians still argue whether the ship itself symbolized a literal journey to the afterlife or a metaphorical passage for the soul. In the harsh climate of Scandinavia, life was brutal and death even more so. But death wasn't just an end, it was a transition. To the Vikings, the afterlife wasn't a vague concept. It was an active, dangerous, and competitive place where only the bravest warriors could expect to find glory. Archaeological digs have revealed that long before Christianity arrived in the region, Viking society operated under a belief system where the dead needed both guidance and supplies for their next life. The idea was simple yet dramatic. A ship could carry you across both sea and spirit, from this world to the next. But it wasn't always a luxurious trip. In one of the most famous Viking ship burials ever uncovered, at Oseberg in Norway, archaeologists found a ship almost perfectly preserved in the peat. The vessel was relatively small, about 22 meters long, but exquisitely carved with interwoven serpent patterns, its prow rising like the neck of a dragon, an intimidating sight meant to ward off evil spirits. Inside lay two women, surrounded by an astonishing collection of textiles, household goods, and even sleds. No warriors, just two women whose identities remain a mystery, though speculation suggests they were either high priestesses or noblewomen. You can't help but wonder, why women? Historians still debate whether these burials represented a form of status entirely separate from that of male warriors, or whether these women were exceptions. Their elaborate grave, laden with possessions, suggests they were far from ordinary. And here, where it gets quirky, alongside the treasures and fine silks, archaeologists found the remains of several horses and even a couple of dogs. Why? Well, apparently, Vikings believed these animals would serve their owners in the afterlife, much like modern humans view pets as beloved companions. The idea that a dog might help you navigate the perilous realm of the dead certainly beats the alternative of facing it alone. But let's not forget the more visceral side of ship burials. Some accounts suggest that the deceased, particularly powerful chieftains, were placed in the ship with the expectation that it would either be set aflame and sent adrift, or sunk deliberately. The fire method makes sense in a practical way. Wood burns, the ship floats, and the spectacle is complete. Yet, sinking them speaks to a different logic, perhaps a symbolic return to the sea, the same element that sustained Viking life and threatened it in equal measure. Imagine standing there, watching the flames reflect off the dark water, the chanting rising and falling like a tide. The funeral pyre crackles, smoke coiling into the heavy sky as the ship begins to drift away. Or perhaps it's weighed down by stones, slowly sinking to become part of the watery grave itself. One particularly quirky discovery was from a site at Vendel in Sweden, where the buried chieftain was found with an elaborate comb set. Yes, combs. While most people today wouldn't expect to pack grooming tools for the afterlife, for the Vikings, personal appearance was a statement of pride and power. After all, who wanted to meet the gods looking disheveled? Then there's the mainstream fact that every ship burial was, in essence, a microcosm of Viking life, a portable home, a fortress of sorts, fully stocked for eternity. Weapons, food, jewelry, and even coins were carefully placed around the deceased, almost as if they were expecting a long voyage ahead, rather than an eternal rest. Of course, we have to tread lightly here. Not every Viking was buried in a ship. Historians still argue whether the ship burial was reserved exclusively for the elite, or if it was more widespread, but lost to time and decomposition. The fact that only a handful of these graves survive makes it impossible to generalize with certainty. So as you stand there on that misty shore, the smell of salt and burning wood mingling in your nostrils, you can't help but feel the weight of history pressing in. This wasn't merely a death ritual. It was an announcement to the universe that you mattered. Whether it's the slow sinking of the ship beneath the waves or the blaze lighting the midnight sky, the message was clear. You wouldn't be forgotten. Anatomy of a ship burial. Break down the anatomy of a typical Viking ship burial, how it was constructed, what was included, and what it symbolized. The ship itself is a marvel you can't help but trace with your eyes, imagining the hands that carved every plank and nailed every joint together. You step closer, feeling the rough grain under your fingertips, imagining the hull creaking as it braces against the cold northern winds. Each Viking ship burial was carefully designed, a combination of practicality and symbolism, a floating, or soon-to-be floating, conduit between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. It's tempting to think of them simply as boats, but in reality, they were sanctuaries, tombs, and status symbols all rolled into one. And as you circle the vessel, you notice the intricate carvings along the gunwales, serpents, dragons, and geometric patterns twisting in ways that seem almost alive in the low light. Historians still argue whether these decorations were meant to protect the dead or simply to display wealth and craftsmanship. Perhaps it was both. You can almost hear the faint echo of hammers and chisels from centuries past, and if you strain, maybe you think you can catch the whisper of those who laid down to sleep here, their breaths mingling with the salty air. Inside, the space is surprisingly confined. For all the grandeur of the ship's exterior, the interior is measured, precise, almost claustrophobic. The deceased's body would lie in the center, surrounded by treasures and items meant to carry them safely into the next world. One of the more mainstream elements of these burials was the layering of personal items. Weapons were always present: swords, axes, spears, sometimes shields, each meticulously placed according to some understood, but now largely mysterious, ritual. Jewelry, combs, gaming pieces, and other everyday items were included as well, suggesting a belief that the dead would continue to need the trappings of daily life. You can almost picture a Viking king reaching for his sword one last time, or a warrior brushing his hair with a delicate comb before facing the afterlife. It's almost charming in its familiarity, even as the underlying context is macabre. Then there's the fringe tidbit that archaeologists uncovered at a burial in Gokstad, Norway. Tiny miniature tools, crafted to miniature scale, were buried alongside the deceased. Some think these were symbolic, meant to serve the dead in their next life, while others speculate the Vikings simply liked tiny things. Because why not? You can't help but chuckle at the image of a miniature Viking axe being wielded by a ghostly figure somewhere in Valhalla. And speaking of Valhalla, let's not overlook the ritual of positioning. Some ships were sunk in lakes, others set alight on rivers or fjords. The method mattered. Floating and burning might symbolize a soul's fiery passage to the gods, whereas sinking could represent the return to the primordial waters from which life itself emerged. These distinctions, however, are still the subject of heated debate among scholars. Some suggest that the choice of water versus land burial had more to do with regional customs or available resources than with theological considerations. The sheer precision of construction is also impressive. Gokstad's ship, for instance, measured nearly 23 meters and featured overlapping planks sewn together with iron rivets, a design that ensured flexibility and strength. It could have sailed, but here, it serves a different function, a vessel for eternity. In some cases, mounds were built over the ships, creating monumental barrows that could be seen from miles away. Standing atop one of these mounds, you'd have a panoramic view of the surrounding land, as if the dead were still watching, still commanding respect from the living. And the placement of the deceased was never random. Warriors often lay with one arm around a sword, the other near a shield. Noblewomen, as in Osberg, were surrounded by domestic objects, reflecting a different kind of power and influence. In every case, though, the layout communicated status, identity, and expected utility in the next life. Historians still argue whether these items were purely symbolic, or if Vikings genuinely believed the dead would need them. But from where you're standing, it feels intuitive. If you were about to sail into the unknown, you'd want your favorite tools at hand. Quirky discoveries also abound. At some burials, archaeologists found animal remains not as companions but as symbols of strength or protection. For example, one mound contained a carved wooden horse, perhaps representing mobility and freedom. Others featured birds, perhaps meant to guide the soul. And in some truly eccentric cases, odd food items, pickled fish, dried meats, or even honey were included, possibly as sustenance for the journey. You can almost imagine a Viking afterlife picnic, complete with tiny rations tucked into a coffin. By the time you step back and take in the full ship, you realize it is a three-dimensional storybook, each plank, carving, an item narrating the life, values, and hopes of someone long gone. It's both practical and poetic, terrifying and strangely comforting. And as you run your hand along the smooth, worn wood, you feel a faint connection across the centuries, a reminder that while the world has changed, the desire to honor the dead, to give them a voyage worthy of memory, is timeless. Rich kings and modest warriors. Dive into fascinating case studies of ship burials, ranging from kings buried with gold to common warriors laid to rest with peculiar items. You trudge along a narrow, winding path through the northern forests, the chill in the air pressing against your cheeks, when you stumble across a burial mound that seems, at first glance, entirely ordinary. But as you step closer, your eyes catch the contours of a longship peeking out from beneath the grass, its hull just visible through centuries of soil and moss. Here, you begin to realize the staggering contrasts between the lives of Vikings. Some rulers and chieftains buried in opulent splendor, others, modest warriors, surrounded by surprisingly peculiar items. Take, for example, the legendary Osberg women you met in Section 1. They were richly adorned, their tomb filled with treasures and carefully prepared goods, their lives commemorated with extraordinary precision. Now, imagine a low-ranking warrior, perhaps a berserker who fought without the benefit of noble birth. At sites like Vixo or Skedamos, the burials are less flamboyant but no less fascinating. A warrior might be interred with his axe, a small shield, a few coins, and sometimes something entirely unexpected, a carved bone whistle or a tiny, crudely made toy horse. These items hint at personal stories lost to time, intimate glimpses into daily life, or perhaps symbolic protection for the afterlife. Historians still argue whether these peculiar inclusions were meant to empower the dead spiritually, serve as comfort items, or simply follow ritualistic tradition. Either way, the objects humanize the deceased in a way that the more grandiose ship burials can't. Here lies someone who laughed, feared, and perhaps even dreamed about the strangest things, carrying their quirks into eternity. And then there are the kings, whose burials are monuments in themselves. Take the famous Gokstad chieftain. His grave included a nearly 23-meter-long ship, complete with a canopy for the deceased, a carefully arranged set of weapons, and even 3 horses tethered inside. Archaeologists speculate these horses were not just symbolic companions, but were meant to transport their master in the afterlife, a sort of personal cavalry waiting on the shores of Valhalla. You can almost hear the snorting and shifting of these animals under the wooden hull, as though they were restless, sensing the impending voyage. Here's a fringe tidbit you'll love. Some burials have revealed gaming pieces, tiny carved figures, dice, and boards, suggesting that even in death, Vikings might have engaged in competitive play. Perhaps the afterlife was considered a place of eternal strategy games, where the dead battled over more than just land and glory. It's both amusing and oddly relatable, imagining a ghostly chess match unfolding somewhere in the clouds. Of course, these interments weren't purely personal. They were deeply social statements. By observing what the deceased took into the grave, you could read their status, accomplishments, and even their personality. A king's tomb screamed power, wealth, and dominion over life and death, while a modest warrior's grave whispered of courage, loyalty, and the smaller, more human aspects of life. Quirks abound. At some burials, you find exotic objects like Mediterranean glass beads, likely obtained through far-reaching trade networks. These tiny treasures tell stories of connections spanning continents, suggesting that Vikings were not only raiders but sophisticated traders who valued aesthetics and rarity. And in some extraordinary cases, archaeologists discovered even more unexpected items, like bear claws or raven feathers, likely imbued with magical or protective significance. You can almost picture the Viking warrior adjusting a feather in his helmet before facing both mortal and immortal battles. Scholars continue to debate whether these inclusions had strictly symbolic purposes, served as status markers, or were intended to literally assist the deceased in the afterlife. Perhaps it was all 3. As you kneel by the mound, brushing away a handful of soil, the past feels tactile, immediate, and strangely intimate. Every item, every carefully chosen artifact becomes a bridge across centuries, connecting you to lives that were both foreign and intimately human. And so, as you stand, the wind rustling through the trees, you grasp a profound truth. Viking burials, whether modest or magnificent, were reflections of the individual and their culture, a delicate balance of pragmatism, belief, and sometimes eccentricity. They remind us that even in death, people crave meaning, status, and occasionally a miniature horse to keep them company. Quirks, controversies, and odd finds reveal bizarre artifacts and strange burial practices, plus current scholarly debates about why Vikings sometimes burned, sometimes sank their ships. The mound you've been circling now reveals its strangest secrets as you dig deeper into the stories embedded in these ship burials. Some artifacts simply defy expectation. At one site in Sweden, archaeologists uncovered a Viking chieftain buried alongside a set of iron chains and a small cauldron filled with what appeared to be resin or pitch. The chains might have symbolized restraint or protection. The cauldron could have served as a ritual vessel, or perhaps just a dramatic way to spice up eternity. Vikings certainly had a flair for the theatrical. Historians still argue whether some of these items were purely symbolic, functional, or designed to impress the living with displays of power. And then there's the oddity factor. At a burial mound in Denmark, researchers found human remains alongside a small, carved wooden figure with exaggerated features, almost cartoonish by today's standards. Was it a spiritual guardian, a protective talisman, or simply a reminder of the deceased's peculiar sense of humor? The truth is elusive, and that's part of the charm. It's also a little comforting. Even in the distant past, people had quirks, playfulness, and maybe even a love of the absurd. Consider the rituals themselves. Some Vikings set their ships ablaze, sending smoke curling into the cold sky, while others sank their ships deliberately into lakes or fjords. Each method carried symbolic weight. Fire represented purification, the soul rising to the gods in blazing glory, while water symbolized a return to the primal depths, the eternal cradle of life. But why choose one over the other? Scholars still debate whether these differences were dictated by regional traditions, status, or personal preference. The answer remains tantalizingly out of reach, like a ship disappearing into mist. Quirky finds continue to emerge. At some sites, archaeologists discovered remnants of wooden shields covered in intricate carvings and sometimes even stuffed with soil or sand. Theories abound. Perhaps the shields were alive in a symbolic sense, ready to defend the dead. Perhaps they were simply practical placeholders, preventing the ship from collapsing. Imagine a Viking warrior in the afterlife, shield in hand, ready for the next unexpected raid, or maybe just arguing with an equally dead neighbor over a dice game. And the oddities don't end there. Some mounds included food items unlikely to survive centuries: pickled herring, dried meats, and even honey jars. Historians argue whether these were meant literally as sustenance for the afterlife or as symbolic gestures of abundance and hospitality. Either way, it's a vivid reminder that Vikings treated death not as an end, but as a journey, a continuation of life's routines in a supernatural setting. Then there's the fringe theory that some burials contained ritualistic sacrifices, human or animal. Sites like the infamous Trelleborg reveal remains that suggest the deceased might have been accompanied by attendants, possibly servants or family members, meant to serve them in the next world. Modern archaeologists debate whether these were voluntary acts, coerced, or misinterpreted entirely. The idea of a person willingly accompanying someone into death is chilling, yet somehow, when placed in the Viking worldview, it feels like a grim reflection of loyalty, status, and belief. And of course, Vikings occasionally threw in a wild card, unusual items that seem entirely whimsical by today's logic. At one burial, a small wooden horse was found beside a chieftain, clearly not for practical use. Perhaps it symbolized speed, mobility, or a companion for eternity. In another, a pair of leather boots, exquisitely crafted, lay neatly folded next to the deceased, suggesting that even in death, Vikings cared about stepping into the afterlife with style. The more you examine these practices, the more apparent it becomes that Viking ship burials were less about uniform ritual and more about personalized narrative. Each grave tells a story, both intimate and public, weaving together power, belief, and the occasional inexplicable whim. And as you brush your hands along the moss-covered timbers, you realize these burials were a dialogue across time, a conversation about mortality, legacy, and human creativity that continues. The legacy of ship burials. Trace how these burial practices influenced later cultures, their rediscovery in modern archaeology, and the myths they continue to inspire. You follow the faint outline of the last burial mound, the fog curling around your boots as though the landscape itself is reluctant to release its secrets. Here, in the quietest corner of the Nordic world, you witness the echoes of a practice that would shape not only Viking culture, but also the imaginations of future generations. Ship burials were more than funerary rites. They were cultural declarations, declarations that life, death, and the spaces in between were matters of ceremony, symbolism, and sometimes sheer spectacle. The legacy of these burials stretches far beyond the fjords and peat bogs where they were first discovered. Archaeologists in the modern era have unearthed these vessels with painstaking care, revealing not only the treasures inside, but also the meticulous craftsmanship of the ships themselves. A famous find, the Osberg ship, is now housed in Oslo, a silent sentinel of the past, where visitors can trace the dragon-headed prow and marvel at the intricate woodwork that survived a millennium. These discoveries inspire not just historians but artists, filmmakers, and writers who have carried the image of the Viking ship burial into popular culture. Movies, books, and video games often depict these vessels as blazing icons of warrior glory, even if the actual burials were more nuanced, involving women, children, and animals. Historians still argue whether the mythology around Valhalla and the afterlife was a driving force behind the burial rites or a later narrative overlay. Either way, the impact is undeniable. The romanticized vision of the Viking longship sailing across misty waters has become a symbol of daring, exploration, and the mystery of death itself. And this imagery has echoes in everything from funeral practices centuries later to modern naval memorials, where the sea is invoked as a liminal space, a boundary between life and whatever lies beyond. Quirky finds continue to pepper our understanding. At some sites, archaeologists discovered items that suggest Vikings were not only practical but also whimsical in death. Miniature tools, oddly shaped vessels, and even dolls accompany the deceased. One burial in Norway included a carved figure of a mythical creature, half bird, half human, whose purpose remains a mystery. Perhaps it was a guardian, perhaps a joke, perhaps a symbol whose meaning is now lost in the fog of time. Whatever the case, these oddities remind you that Vikings, despite their ferocity, had humor and imagination woven into their cultural DNA. The social implications of ship burials are also profound. They codified hierarchy, reinforcing the distinction between elites and commoners. Kings and chieftains were commemorated in elaborate ceremonies, while lower-ranking warriors might receive more modest, but no less meaningful interments. Every inclusion, every arrangement, broadcast identity, allegiance, and aspiration to both the living and the dead. You can almost hear the echoes of a distant audience, neighbors, clansmen, and rival tribes, watching the fire, listening to the chants, absorbing the subtle, potent messages about power and legacy. And finally, as the centuries pass, these burial practices have transformed into legends. Tales of Viking ships carrying kings to the afterlife ripple through folklore, inspiring myths that persist today. They remind us of a people whose worldview merged the practical, the symbolic, and the poetic, a people who saw death not as an end but as a journey, an opportunity to declare once more who they were, even when facing the unknown. You stand there on that foggy shore, imagining the longships drifting silently into the horizon, and feel a strange kinship. The desire to be remembered, to leave a trace, to tell a story that endures beyond the fleeting span of Viking's early shadows. The boy Harold grows up amidst exile, blood feuds, and Norway's harsh winters, learning early that survival is never guaranteed. You start your story in Norway, 1015. Harold Sigurdsson, later Hardrada, enters life with a grim kind of fate etched into his bloodline. His father, Sigurdsur, is a minor king in Oslandit, a land of fjords and forests, and his mother, Astag Gudbrandsdatter, is sharp and quietly ambitious. Even as a boy, Harold senses that royal blood doesn't protect you, it just makes your enemies bolder. You can practically feel the icy wind from the Oslofjord biting your cheeks as you imagine him shivering in a crude wooden longhouse, hearing the creak of timber and the groans of animals in the stalls. Historians still argue whether his exile was motivated more by political calculation or personal vendetta, but either way, it plants a seed that will grow into an unyielding drive. By the age of 15, Harold's world explodes into chaos. King Olaf II has tightened his grip on Norway, and Harold's family becomes political collateral. You watch the young boy flee across snowy ridges and dark forests, the snow muffling the thundering horses behind him, feeling that chill of isolation creeping into your bones. Quirky little tidbit. Some sagas suggest Harold may have trained himself to endure pain by deliberately sleeping outdoors during the coldest nights, wrapped only in a thin cloak, probably giving him the Viking version of a hardcore survival tick-tock. Exile in Kievan Rus gives Harold lessons no school could. Imagine a marketplace where the smells of dried fish, horse dung, and fresh bread mix in one pungent cloud. You, young Harold, must navigate language, culture, and mercenary politics just to survive. He hones skills in swordplay and strategy, but also the subtle art of charm, making allies from strangers while plotting revenge for his father's death. Here, you notice he isn't just a future king. He's a student of power, learning how fear and loyalty can coexist in the hearts of men. During this time, Harold experiences the thrill of both camaraderie and betrayal. You can almost feel the cold bite of a river crossing on a merchant's boat as rumors swirl that some of his companions plan to sell him out. And yet, he thrives. Mainstream history marks this period as his formative mercenary years, shaping the ruthless pragmatism that will define his rule. Quirky note: legend says Harold once competed in a drinking contest with a Viking chieftain who drank fermented shark blood. And yes, it left him slightly green around the edges. Historians still argue whether this actually happened, or if the saga writers just liked making their heroes grotesquely epic. By the end of his teenage years, Harold has learned three crucial things: the value of patience, the cost of miscalculation, and the intoxicating appeal of danger. You trace his path through frozen forests, crowded city streets, and icy rivers, feeling the pulse of a young man destined for legend. Remember, this is just the beginning. Before swords, crowns, and battles, there is the boy who learned to survive in a world that would have eaten you alive without a second thought. You hear the wind howl outside. Imagine the soft crunch of snow beneath a boot, and sense that this is where the fire first ignited. Mercenary on distant shores. Harold ventures to Byzantium, serving as a feared Varangian guard, mastering wealth, politics, and the brutal art of reputation. You're no longer in the quiet forests of Norway. Now you trudge through the bustling streets of Constantinople, a city so vast it almost feels alive under your feet. The air smells of exotic spices, sweat, and the faint tang of the sea. You're Harold, now a young man hardened by exile and the bitter lessons of survival, stepping into a world far richer and far more dangerous than anything back home. So before you get too cozy, remember, this isn't a sightseeing trip. This is a place where mistakes can get you impaled, drowned, or worse, quietly erased. By the time Harold arrives, the Byzantine Empire is at its height, its walls bristling with soldiers, merchants, and intrigue. You walk among marble columns and hear the distant chimes of church bells while soldiers in gleaming armor march past, their spears glinting in the sun. The Varangian Guard, an elite band of mercenaries mostly made up of Scandinavians like Harold, is recruiting. They're feared not just for their skill with axes, but for their reputation as men who are unflinchingly loyal, until, of course, loyalty intersects with gold. Historians still argue whether Harold's meteoric rise in the Guard was due to brilliance, brute force, or sheer audacity. You, in the moment, would feel all three. Training is relentless. Imagine the clang of axes meeting shields over and over, the sting of cold rain soaking through woolen tunics, and the ache in muscles you didn't know existed. Quirky fact: some sources suggest Harold had a ritual of sharpening his axes while reciting poetry aloud, blending artistry with lethal intent. Basically, the Viking equivalent of doing calisthenics while writing your resume. You can almost hear the echoing walls of the barracks as he swings, chanting, "I am Harold and I will not break," even as his knuckles bleed. Life in Constantinople isn't just battle, it's politics, intrigue, and gold. Harold learns quickly that power is a combination of strength, timing, and the occasional bribe. You watch him navigate the labyrinthine palace corridors, smiling to the emperor's advisors while nodding their weaknesses. You feel the tension in the air as he balances friendship and suspicion. Every handshake could be a trap, every compliment a subtle knife. Mainstream history emphasizes this as the period where Harold not only becomes a feared warrior, but also a shrewd tactician, a man who can read the battlefield as well as the room. But there's more than strategy in his heart. There's a longing for home and vengeance. Every coin he earns, every battle he survives, is a step toward reclaiming the throne he was denied. Picture the nights when the moon hangs low over the Golden Horn, Harold staring at its dark waters, imagining the fjords of Norway, and swearing silently that he will return, stronger and smarter. Quirky tidbit. Some sagas claim Harold once challenged a lion, kept in the emperor's menagerie, to a duel. And while the story is almost certainly exaggerated, it reflects the almost mythic fearlessness the young Viking cultivated. Even amidst the glamour and danger, you notice the formative patterns of a king emerging. Harold learns patience, adaptability, and the delicate balance between ferocity and cunning. You can sense it when he negotiates his pay, chooses allies among the guard, or outmaneuvers rivals seeking to discredit him. This is where the legend begins to crystallize. A man molded by exile, tested by war, and tempered by ambition. Historians still argue whether his time in Byzantium made him more brutal or more calculating. But what's undeniable is that it made him unforgettable. By the time Harold departs Constantinople, wealth in his pockets and experience etched into his soul, he is no longer just a survivor. He is a force poised to reclaim his destiny. You can almost feel the salt air of the journey home on your tongue, the rumble of oars through the water, and the whisper of the north calling him back. Every step, every swing of his axe has prepared him for the crown, claiming Norway's throne. Returning home, Harold navigates alliances, betrayal, and civil war, slowly weaving himself into the tapestry of Norwegian kingship. The long voyage home feels endless, the wooden hull creaking underfoot as waves lash against it, each swell a reminder that Harold is leaving behind the opulence of Constantinople for the unpredictable fury of Norway. You trudge across the deck alongside him, feeling the icy spray sting your face, imagining the look of fjords emerging from the fog in the distance, familiar, yet treacherous. He is returning not just as a man, but as a warrior, a tactician, and a claimant to a throne that has been contested during his absence. So keep your wits about you. In this land, trust is a currency more volatile than gold. Upon arrival, Harold finds Norway fractured. Civil war simmers beneath the surface, with rival chieftains and ambitious nobles all vying for power. You follow Harold through towns scarred by previous conflicts, watching him read the currents of local politics with the keen eye of a seasoned strategist. Historians still argue whether Harold's initial approach, leveraging alliances and calculated threats, was brilliant diplomacy or ruthless manipulation. You feel the tension as every handshake could bind a new ally or unleash a hidden dagger. Harold's claim is rooted in both blood and boldness. His father Sigurd's lineage gives him legitimacy, but lineage alone won't secure a crown. You watch as Harold negotiates marriages, forms temporary alliances, and even employs mercenaries, moving like a chess master across the board of Norwegian politics. Quirky tidbit. Some sagas describe Harold hosting banquets where he secretly tested the loyalty of his guests by subtly poisoning food for animals, observing reactions, and marking any who laughed nervously. Morbidly clever, yes, but effective. War is inevitable. Harold mobilizes his forces, and you feel the tension rise as battle plans are drawn across tables and maps made of stretched animal hides. The clash of armies is both brutal and hypnotic, the crash of swords, the thundering of hooves, and the cries of men echoing across valleys. Mainstream history marks Harold's campaigns as a combination of tactical genius and relentless determination, often allowing him to outmaneuver rivals who underestimated his cunning. Yet Harold's story isn't only about force, it's about perception. He understands the power of spectacle, of legend. You notice him deliberately appearing at gatherings in armor polished to a gleam, with banners fluttering in the wind, creating an aura that precedes his actual presence on the battlefield. It's charisma and fear wrapped together, a tool that turns hesitation into surrender. Quirky note. Some sources suggest Harold once staged an elaborate ghost army, using straw figures and torches to make his forces appear larger. Historians still debate whether this happened, or if the saga writers just enjoyed theater. Through patience, cunning, and sheer persistence, Harold gradually consolidates power. By the time he is crowned, you sense a profound transformation. The boy who fled exile now commands respect, fear, and loyalty in equal measure. You can almost hear the low hum of celebration in the air, the soft crackle of fires across villages, and the wary glances of former rivals recognizing that a new king has emerged. This is the point where survival, ambition, and destiny converge, creating the Harald Hardrada remembered conquest, dreams, and schemes. He dreams beyond Norway, eyeing England, Denmark, and Iceland, balancing ambition with strategy, luck, and occasional misfortune. The crown sits heavily on Harald's head, and you feel the weight of not just gold and jewels, but of responsibility, ambition, and the unspoken expectation of conquest. Norway is under his rule, yet Harald's gaze drifts beyond fjords and forests, toward distant shores he has long dreamed of, England, Denmark, and even the lands whispered about in the north, where sagas hint at riches and glory waiting for the daring. So brace yourself. This isn't simply kingship, it's a restless pursuit that refuses to let him rest. Harald begins by securing his home front, forging alliances with chieftains, and quelling dissent with a mix of tact and intimidation. You walk beside him as he surveys coastal villages, listening to reports from envoys, and feeling the pulse of a nation still raw from previous conflicts. Historians still argue whether Harald's internal policies were primarily about justice or about consolidating power through fear, but either way, they worked. People obeyed, grudgingly or willingly, and the foundation for broader ambitions was laid. But ambition is never satisfied with stability alone. Harald's eyes turn to England, a land of fertile plains and divided rulers. You can sense the excitement and anxiety as he plans the logistics of crossing the North Sea, weighing ships, men, provisions, and the ever-volatile weather. Quirky tidbit. Some sagas suggest Harald once had his captains rehearse landings by throwing sacks of flour over each other to simulate combat chaos, a strangely effective, if messy, form of tactical rehearsal. You can almost see the white clouds puffing into the air as Harald barks orders, turning practice into legend long before the real battles begin. His strategy blends patience, deception, and occasional brute force. You imagine fleets moving silently under moonlight, warriors readying axes and shields, Harald at the helm, eyes scanning the horizon. Mainstream history credits him with remarkable logistical skills, a rare trait for a Viking warlord, allowing him to stage campaigns that other leaders deemed impossible. Yet even as he plans invasions, he contemplates alliances, occasionally entertaining offers from Denmark or the English nobility to settle disputes peacefully, though always with one eye on opportunity. Beyond strategy, Harald's personality shapes his campaigns. You notice the mixture of charisma, ferocity, and legend building. Soldiers swear loyalty to him not just because of pay, but because of the man himself, his audacity, the stories of his exploits in Byzantium, and the subtle intimidation that he wields effortlessly. Quirky note. It is said Harald once challenged a rival king to a duel, then arrived late, dramatically, giving the impression he could dominate not only a man but time itself. Historians still argue whether this story is literal truth or literary embellishment, but the effect on morale is clear. By the time the fleet set sail for England, you feel the tension of anticipation and the weight of destiny. Each wave, each gust of wind, carries Harald closer to the ambitions that have driven him for decades. You hear the roar of the sea, the creak of timbers, and the quiet murmurs of men wondering if their king is fearless or reckless. But Harald moves with the certainty of a man who has survived exile, war, and betrayal. He is no longer just a king of Norway. He is a Viking whose dreams will challenge empires and whose legacy will echo through centuries. Origins of courtly desire. Trace the birth of courtly love in medieval Europe, from troubadours in Provence to the aristocratic salons, where secret longing became an art form. You trudge through the cobbled streets of a bustling medieval town, feet squelching in mud softened by rain, and notice banners fluttering with the coats of local nobility. These banners aren't just decorative. Their announcements of rank, alliances, and occasionally unspoken romantic entanglements. The idea of courtly love, the notion that devotion, often secret, could elevate the soul, originates in Provence, the sunny south of France, sometime around the late 11th century. Here, poetry wasn't just entertainment. It was a tool, a carefully sharpened weapon of emotion, meant to convey the subtleties of desire without touching anyone's actual shoulder. You almost have to admire the patience and restraint, even if you secretly suspect a lot of these poets were just showing off. Historians still argue whether this obsession with unattainable love was genuinely spiritual or merely a clever social game. As you wander past a fountain that splashes in the warm afternoon sun, you overhear a troubadour reciting, in lilting Provençal, a tale of a knight hopelessly devoted to a married lady. The language is florid, dripping with metaphors of flowers, wounds, and sighs, and you can't help but smirk at how the same themes, jealousy, longing, secret rendezvous, would later fill modern romance novels. Yet there's a kernel of truth here. These performances codified behavior. A well-placed compliment in verse could secure favors, marriages, or at least a reputation as a man of taste. And while mainstream history often presents courtly love as lofty and refined, there's a quirky fringe of scholarship suggesting some of these gestures were less about moral virtue and more about one-upmanship, basically medieval flexing, complete with lute accompaniment. You move through a garden walled with roses, their scent cloying in the afternoon sun, and imagine a knight pausing mid-quest to compose a poem on a lady's beauty. He's technically fighting dragons or rival lords in his daily life, but in the evenings, he's scribbling sonnets about hair color and hand gestures, as if his reputation hinges on metaphorical prowess rather than martial skill. This juxtaposition, the battlefield versus the boudoir, defines early courtly love. The idea that longing could be ennobling, that suffering for love was virtuous, influenced not only literature but the way nobles interacted with one another. Courtiers would attend balls, tournaments, or banquets armed not only with swords but with clever compliments, secret glances, and coded letters. Quirky asides abound. For instance, there are accounts of nobles using musical notes or specific dance steps as secret love messages. Imagine someone trying to flirt through a cha-cha. It's like Morse code with more silk and fewer beeps. And then there's the slightly absurd practice of trial marriages, where a nobleman could, under certain circumstances, be romantically attached to a lady for a fixed period as a kind of social experiment. You can almost hear the troubadour muttering, and they said poetry couldn't change the world. The troubadours themselves were a mixed lot, sometimes noble, sometimes itinerant, sometimes shamelessly opportunistic. They traveled from court to court, offering finely crafted verses in exchange for gifts, meals, or lodging. Historians still debate whether these poets genuinely loved the women they praised, or if they were performing a sophisticated game of social currency, turning emotions into coins and applause. Regardless, their influence was undeniable. Without their carefully chosen words, the entire edifice of courtly love might have collapsed into a less entertaining, far less romantic system of arranged marriages and blunt insults. You pause at a fountain's edge, dipping your fingers into the cool water, and consider the codification of desire. Certain behaviors, kneeling before a lady, presenting a glove, composing a dedicated poem, were not only expected but essential for social survival in aristocratic circles. In essence, love became a formalized performance. A failed compliment or forgotten token could result in scandal or social ostracism. And yet, despite the rules, there was room for humor, for subtle rebellion. Some knights reportedly exaggerated tales of their devotion to absurd degrees, making themselves heroic and ridiculous all at once. It's an early lesson in human behavior. Where there's rigid structure, there's also cheeky creativity. Step into the evenings now. Candlelight flickers against stone walls, the air thick with roasted meats, wax, and the occasional whiff of horse. The troubadours perform their songs to half-listening audiences, as knights practice courtesy alongside swordplay and noblewomen exchange knowing glances. Secret admiration notes pass under the table like contraband. You're immersed in the delicate chaos of a world where longing is an art form and etiquette is armor. Even the most minor gesture, a carefully bowed head, a perfumed handkerchief, carries weight. Scholars still argue whether this obsessive idealization of love was genuinely transformative for society or merely a sophisticated social theater. But either way, it shaped the imagination of Europe for centuries. And as you finally step back from the noise of the court, letting your mind drift across its gardens, halls, and banquet rooms, you notice the first threads of something enduring. The notion that love could be ennobling, performative, secretive, and slightly ridiculous is born here, not just in grand gestures but in quiet, meticulously composed words. It's a strange, intoxicating blend of artistry and social maneuvering, of desire and discipline, and it is only just beginning. Knights' quests and chivalric codes. Explore how knights were molded not just for battle, but for poetry, honor, and impossible devotion, blending martial skill with etiquette and unrequited passion. You rise with the sun, not that the birds care about nightly schedules, and step into the training yard, where the clatter of swords and the grunts of men preparing for combat form a strangely comforting rhythm. Knights are not born, they are made, forged in both steel and social expectation, their lives a careful balancing act between prowess on the battlefield and devotion in the boudoir. Imagine your own reflection in the polished armor, gleaming, intimidating, and yet under that metal, a heart primed for poetry, for careful gestures, for longing. This is the paradox of chivalric culture. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time, because apparently the ghosts of medieval courtiers are watching from every time zone. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The code of chivalry is more than just rules about jousting. It's a framework for honor, behavior, and the proper treatment of women, rivals, and even peasants. Knights were expected to defend the weak, fight bravely, and above all, embody the ideals of their society, ideals that were paradoxically both rigid and performative. Historians still argue whether these codes were ever genuinely followed, or if they were aspirational documents that most knights ignored unless someone was watching. You imagine a knight bowing deeply, presenting a flower to a lady while simultaneously planning to ride into a rival lord's lands at dawn, heroic and absurd all at once. As you pace the yard, a squire hurries past, carrying a heavy wooden shield, the rough grain pressing into your palms, the smell of sawdust and sweat mingling with early morning dew. Knights train tirelessly, not just to perfect the thrust of a lance, but to master the subtle gestures of courtly behavior. A controlled bow, a whispered compliment, the ability to read body language as carefully as any battlefield formation. These dual skills, martial and social, were inseparable. A knight who failed in either could find himself mocked, humiliated, or worse, romantically irrelevant. And yet, there's a quirky side to this education. Some schools of knighthood reportedly included lessons in poetry recitation, dancing, and even embroidery, because nothing screams impressive like a broadsword and a perfectly stitched handkerchief. Picture the tournaments, banners fluttering, horns blaring, the smell of roasted meat competing with sweat and horse dung. Knights compete not merely for prizes but for reputation, and reputation often intertwines with the admiration of noble ladies. A tilt of the lance, a victorious shout, a carefully executed bow, all of it is theater. And the prizes, sometimes gold, sometimes land, and occasionally the favor of a lady who might reward a clever sonnet with a gloved hand or a lock of hair. Quirky records tell us that some knights kept detailed scorecards of their romantic exploits alongside battle victories, a ledger of ambition that blurs the line between earnest devotion and absurd vanity. You pause to watch a knight demonstrate a maneuver, the wooden lance bouncing harmlessly against the training dummy. The movements are precise, choreographed almost like a dance. It's no accident. Chivalric culture elevates the very act of movement into symbolism. Every step, every tilt, every flourish communicates courage, skill, and decorum. Scholars still debate whether these performances were genuine expressions of virtue or elaborate displays meant to manipulate social perception. Either way, the effect is mesmerizing. The battlefield and the ballroom, the crush of desire and the clash of steel, all intertwined into a single, demanding lifestyle. The lessons of chivalry extend into personal conduct. Knights are taught humility, loyalty, and the careful management of emotion. Though let's be honest, these instructions often clash spectacularly with their natural impulses. Imagine the absurdity of a man who spends all day sparring, drinking mead, and hunting, then kneels for hours crafting a poem about the unattainable lady of the court. Yet this duality, strength tempered by sensitivity, is the essence of chivalric romance. It teaches restraint, patience, and the art of presentation, while also providing endless material for troubadours, gossip, and chroniclers with a flair for exaggeration. Speaking of exaggeration, here's a delightful tidbit. Some knights reportedly carried small tokens of devotion tucked into their armor, bits of cloth, locks of hair, miniature effigies, as secret encouragements during battle. Imagine swinging a sword with your sweetheart's embroidered handkerchief pressed against your chest. It's both touching and slightly hilarious. The intersection of danger and sentimentality is so absurd it almost seems designed for modern memes. As the sun climbs higher, you trudge through a parade of drills, ceremonies, and small duels, absorbing the rhythm of life designed to sculpt both body and mind. Each knight's identity is inseparable from performance. The way they wield a sword mirrors the way they wield words. The way they bow mirrors the way they approach a beloved. It's a world where action and affection are inseparably fused, where the spectacle of devotion matters as much as the devotion itself. And amid all of this, the ever-present scholarly debate lingers. Were knights genuinely moved by ideals of honor and love, or were they simply performing what society demanded? Perhaps both, or perhaps one is meaningless without the other. By dusk, the yard empties, and you sit on a wooden bench, armor loosened, sword at your side, heart thrumming with exertion. The day has been filled with movement, ritual, and fleeting glances across the courtyard. You realize that this is the heartbeat of chivalric life, a world where heroism and longing, skill and sentiment, danger and etiquette collide in a constant, dizzying ballet. Knights are soldiers, poets, lovers, and performers all at once, and it is this complex fusion that shapes the stories you will hear next, the tales of forbidden, scandalous, and idealized love that will haunt the halls of history for centuries. Tales of forbidden and idealized love. Dive into legendary romances, Lancelot Tristan, Isolde, where longing, secrecy, and scandalous attraction fueled both poetry and peril. You step into a dimly lit chamber, the faint scent of lavender and candle smoke curling around you, and immediately the air feels heavy with unspoken desire. Tales of forbidden love hang in the tapestried walls like ghostly witnesses, Tristan pinning for Isolde, Lancelot kneeling for Guinevere, each story a collision of devotion, secrecy, and social peril. You trudge forward, brushing your hand against the carved wooden balustrade, imagining the whispered confessions and stolen glances that inspired entire cycles of poetry and song. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And of course, drop your location and local time in the comments so we can track just how far these tales have traveled. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The stories themselves are a tangled weave of desire and danger. Lancelot's love for Guinevere is a perfect example, valorous, obsessive, and entirely scandalous. Mainstream accounts present it as a tragic yet ennobling devotion, but here's the quirkier side. Some chroniclers insist Lancelot's feelings were less about romantic love and more about demonstrating his superiority, blending flirtation with strategic political positioning. Historians still argue whether these stories reflect genuine courtly emotions, or if they are elaborate morality plays designed to teach lessons about loyalty, honor, and the peril of succumbing to temptation. As you wander through the corridors, you notice small, deliberate symbols of affection left in hidden corners: a ring atop a folded glove, a pressed flower tucked into a book. These tokens are the medieval version of sliding into DMs, only with more formality and higher stakes. In some cases, knights and ladies would exchange entire coded languages through poetry, gestures, or even the positioning of chairs at a banquet. The very architecture of courtly life, banquet halls, balconies, secret gardens, was designed to facilitate both observation and concealment, the public and private eternally intertwined. Then there's the story of Tristan and Isolde, a tale that almost reads like a warning label. Their love begins with a potion, magical, accidental, or metaphorical, depending on your source, and rapidly escalates into a series of clandestine meetings, narrow escapes, and moral quandaries. Quirky as it seems, some scholars suggest the potion might represent the intoxicating effects of societal pressure, a symbolic illustration of how social rules and human desire create situations that feel both inevitable and catastrophic. You can almost feel the tension as you move past a carved wooden door, imagining Tristan hiding behind tapestries, waiting for the briefest glimpse of his beloved. You trudge up a winding staircase, the stone steps uneven beneath your boots, and consider the broader cultural purpose of these romances. They are not mere entertainment. They encode values, aspirations, and anxieties: how to love without dishonor, how to desire without ruin, how to navigate social and political constraints. Knights and ladies were constantly negotiating these boundaries, and their stories were carefully curated by poets and chroniclers to reflect both idealized conduct and cautionary tales. Sometimes the line between heroic devotion and self-destructive obsession is perilously thin. A quirky fact surfaces in your wandering thoughts. Some medieval texts describe secret rendezvous that involve elaborate disguises, secret tunnels, or messages delivered by trained animals. Imagine a sparrow acting as a medieval Tinder messenger, carrying a note across battlements. It's both ridiculous and strangely charming, a reminder that human ingenuity in pursuit of love has always bordered on theatrical absurdity. Historians still debate how much of this is exaggerated myth versus actual practice, but regardless, it adds texture to the understanding of how people lived and loved. You pause in a sunlit chamber where tapestries depict knights on quests, their eyes fixed on distant, idealized ladies. These images are both aspirational and instructive. They teach young nobles the gestures and behaviors expected in courtly society, and they codify the performance of longing. The act of loving becomes intertwined with narrative, each gesture, glance, and word a contribution to a collective story larger than any one individual. The stakes are real. A misplaced word or indiscreet glance could ruin reputations, incite jealousy, or provoke duels. And yet the drama ensures enduring fascination. The more impossible the love, the more compelling the tale. By evening, the chamber grows quiet, shadows stretching across the floors and walls. You imagine Lancelot kneeling in silent anguish, Tristan packing in desperation, each trapped between desire and duty. These narratives exemplify the paradoxical nature of courtly love. The greater the impossibility, the more noble the devotion, the more enthralling the story. You realize that in these tales, longing itself becomes a kind of art, painful, meticulous, and exquisitely performed. They shape not only individual behavior but also collective imagination, leaving a legacy that stretches centuries into literature, theater, and, eventually, the subtle dramas of modern romance. And as you finally exit the chamber, feeling the cool stone under your hands, you carry with you the sense that these stories, wild, tragic, and slightly absurd, are not just medieval relics. They are templates for understanding desire, performance, and the complex dance between secrecy and expression, a pattern of human behavior as old as society itself. The performance of love in courtly life. Examine rituals, tournaments, and gestures of devotion, how gifts, poetry, and symbolic acts turned love into theater and social currency. You step out into the open courtyard just as the late afternoon sun filters through banners and trellises, casting patterns of light and shadow across the stone. Tournaments are underway, the air vibrating with the clash of lances, the neighing of horses, and the occasional shout from a frustrated squire. Yet beneath this display of martial prowess lies another, subtler performance, the performance of love itself. Courtly gestures are everywhere, interwoven into ceremonies, feasts, and tournaments. A knight presents a handkerchief at the tilt, a lady offers a nod from her balcony, and the entire spectacle becomes theater, a dance of admiration, rivalry, and desire. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time, because clearly we're mapping this courtly madness worldwide. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The rituals of courtly life are as rigid as they are performative. Tournaments, for example, are not just contests of skill, they are elaborate displays of devotion. Knights wear colors and symbols representing the ladies they admire, and each tilt, strike, and victory is a form of communication. A victory is more than personal glory. It signals worthiness, valor, and attentiveness to the social hierarchy of affection. Historians still argue whether these rituals were genuinely about romantic devotion or merely a socially acceptable way to flaunt wealth, skill, and ambition. Either way, the effect is mesmerizing. Love as public spectacle, desire as performance, honor as the ultimate stage prop. You wander toward the banquet hall, where the air smells of roasted meats, spiced wine, and beeswax candles. Nobles are seated according to rank, their every gesture observed, their every word weighed. Poetry, song, and subtle compliments are exchanged like currency. The act of gift-giving is central. A glove, a lock of hair, a carefully embroidered token carries layers of meaning, a private message wrapped in public spectacle. A quirky detail. Some courts even employed professional flatterers, whose sole job was to compose or perform poems that exaggerated a noble's virtues, basically medieval hype men. It's charming and slightly ridiculous, like watching a social influencer of the 12th century at work. The architecture itself encourages this performance. Balconies, alcoves, and hidden corridors allow secret observations and whispered conversations. Gardens are labyrinthine, providing both a literal and figurative space for maneuvering in the game of affection. Courtiers learned to use space as language, where they stood, how they walked, and even which path they chose to enter a hall all signaled intent, admiration, or caution. You can almost hear a narrator from a modern rom-com pointing out the subtle significance of every glance. You move past a group of musicians playing a lilting melody, their notes floating through the hall. Music was another tool in the performance of love. It could signal affection, longing, or playful mockery. Some of the quirkiest accounts suggest that certain rhythms or instruments were used to encode secret messages, like a musical Morse code for the aristocracy. Scholars still debate how widespread and effective these coded signals actually were, but the fact that people tried at all illustrates the ingenuity and theatricality embedded in courtly life. At the center of the hall, you notice a tableau of kneeling knights presenting gifts to seated ladies. The movements are choreographed, each gesture laden with meaning. To fail in form was to risk humiliation. To succeed was to secure social prestige, and perhaps even the favor of the admired lady. The stakes were high, and yet the theater of courtly love allowed a controlled space for play, experimentation, and subtle rebellion. Knights could exaggerate gestures to the point of absurdity. Ladies could flaunt their power through carefully measured reactions, and poets could amplify or distort the entire scene for dramatic effect. Even beyond tournaments and banquets, daily life in the court is suffused with symbolic acts. A shared meal, a carefully delivered compliment, a fleeting touch, all are performative gestures that encode both personal desire and social expectation. Quirky as it sounds, some noble households reportedly maintained manuals for proper courtly conduct, detailing everything from how to accept a gift to the precise way to smile while acknowledging admiration. It's both rigid and playful, a constant negotiation of sincerity and display. By dusk, the courtyard quiets, lanterns glowing softly, shadows stretching long across stone and flagstone. You realize that courtly life is a continuous theater, where love is enacted as much as it is felt. Every step, gesture, and glance is part of a complex language, teaching participants to perform desire, to negotiate affection, and to navigate the intricate social hierarchies of medieval aristocracy. The lessons here are subtle but enduring. Love is both art and strategy, devotion is both private and public, and every moment is an opportunity for storytelling. You pause at the edge of the garden, letting the last light filter through your hair, and consider the enduring echoes of these performances. The rituals, the gestures, the coded communications, these are not just curiosities of a bygone era. They shape the way stories of love are told for centuries, influencing literature, theater, and even contemporary culture. And in that quiet moment, you see the beauty of it. A world where love is simultaneously earnest, theatrical, and delightfully absurd. A living performance that continues to inspire and perplex even now. Legacy and modern echoes. Consider how medieval ideals of love still haunt novels, movies, and dating culture today, and why scholars debate the line between fantasy and social reality. You step into the quiet of a modern library, imagining it as a vast medieval court, rows of books standing in for tapestries and scrolls, each spine a potential love story, each page a silent witness to longing and devotion. The ideals of courtly love and chivalric romance have survived centuries, not only in literature but in the cultural imagination, subtly shaping how we imagine heroism, passion, and devotion even today. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And yes, leave your location and local time in the comments, because even medieval ideals seem to have gone global. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The legacy of these medieval narratives is profound. Consider the romantic novels of the 19th and 20th centuries. The dashing hero rescuing the imperiled lady, the tension between desire and duty, the symbolic tokens of devotion. These are all echoes of medieval ideals. Even modern media, movies, video games, and popular TV shows borrow heavily from the motifs of impossible longing, secret affection, and heroic quests infused with emotional stakes. Scholars still argue whether our cultural obsession with grand gestures and idealized romance is a direct inheritance of these traditions, or if it reflects a broader human tendency toward dramatizing desire. You stroll past shelves filled with art history volumes and illuminated manuscripts, imagining the colors and textures of medieval pages, gilded letters, hand-painted miniatures, each designed to awe, instruct, and inspire. The idea of unattainable love continues to captivate. The image of the knight who fights, not just for glory, but for the favor of a lady, resonates with the archetype of the ideal partner, even in contemporary narratives. Quirky tidbits persist, too. Some modern writers still include deliberately archaic or anachronistic gestures, like using roses or gloves as tokens of love, as a subtle nod to their medieval forebears. Even in everyday romance, the traces of these ideals are palpable. Consider etiquette, courtship rituals, or social performances designed to communicate interest or devotion. Some are subtle, like paying close attention to a partner's preferences, while others are more dramatic, like elaborate proposals or symbolic gifts. Medieval patterns of behavior may seem exaggerated, but they reveal enduring human desires to be seen, to be admired, and to have affection recognized publicly and privately. Historians still debate whether these behaviors are naturally recurring archetypes or directly inherited from historical practices, but the parallels are fascinating. You wander through an exhibit of medieval artifacts, a carefully embroidered glove, a knight's helmet, a fragment of an illuminated manuscript. Each object whispers stories of devotion, performance, and social negotiation. They remind you that love, even in its most idealized forms, has always been performative. A glance, a gift, a gesture. These are not trivialities but expressions of cultural norms, shaping social interaction across centuries. The past continues to teach, inspire, and sometimes amuse. Quirky remnants of courtly love linger in the oddest places. Weddings with medieval themes, historical reenactments, or even romanticized video games where knights and ladies navigate quests of the heart. These echoes demonstrate the endurance of an imaginative framework that blends longing, heroism, and social performance. They remind you that what once seemed absurdly rigid or theatrical can still hold emotional resonance. By evening, you settle into a quiet chair, the world outside dimming into shadows. The patterns of courtly love and chivalric romance, its ideals, absurdities, and lessons, linger in your mind. You reflect on the ways these centuries-old narratives shape stories, manners, and imagination, forming a tapestry that continues to ripple into modern culture. Love, you realize, is both timeless and endlessly performative, a dance that stretches from the candle-lit courts of Provence to your own modern life. And as you finally let your thoughts drift, imagining knights, troubadours, and secretive glances fading into history, you notice the subtle rhythm of their influence in every story you've ever heard about longing, heroism, and devotion. It is a gentle reminder that even the quirkiest rituals, the most impossible romances, and the most elaborate performances of desire leave traces, whispering across centuries, inviting you to consider the beauty and absurdity of loving, performing, and imagining together.